Unity, sovereignty, one voice. Jean-Claude Juncker's final State of the Union here in Strasbourg today had a clear theme. The president of the European Commission pleaded for an end to what he called the sorry spectacle of a divided Europe. And he stressed the importance of a united EU. But then hours later, some would argue that arguably the real State of the Union emerged, with MEPs voting to discipline one of their own, as you both were mentioning, by triggering Article 7 against Hungary. And we will get into that story in just a bit. But first, Jean-Claude Juncker's last State of the Union address.
European sovereignty can never be to the detriment of others. Europe is a continent of openness and tolerance. It will remain so. Europe will never be a fortress, turning its back on the world or those suffering within it. Europe is not an island. I call on the Council presidency to now make the decisive step to broker a sustainable solution on migration reform.
We also ask the British government to understand that someone who leaves the Union cannot be in the same privileged position as a member state. If you leave the Union, you are, of course, no longer part of our single market. The
Commission will resist all attacks on the rule of law. We continue to be very concerned by the developments in some of our member states. Article 7 must be applied whenever the rule of law is threatened.
Well, the State of the Union address also included some key announcements. Juncker called for a new partnership with Africa that would see 10 million jobs created in 5 years. He also promised new rules to protect elections from external manipulation. And he also took aim at plastics, calling for a new anti-plastics law. He called for a clock changing as well, saying that member states decide whether to live in summer or winter time. All right, well, let's discuss what Jean-Claude Juncker said today. Ryan, we were talking before the program started, and you had your opinion on the whole speech, in fact. What do you think?
I think it was haphazard. I didn't see a lot of energy. There are some nice sentiments in that speech, but if you compare Juncker and how he defends Europe with his spokesperson, Margarita Skinas, will come on with a lot more energy in a few minutes and defend him compared to what Juncker was saying today, or other people who are passionate about the project. He felt very flat today, like you were giving a history lesson rather than really going in with a political punch.
Yeah, so, just with insight, because you used to be a speechwriter. How does that happen if a speech like this comes out?
It's a really difficult process. So when I wrote one of these State of the Union speeches, 17 drafts before a president even looked at it. It's a mess. There are lots of people that want to have input. So you really need a president who's going to take control and put a lot of thinking in advance. And I think some of the ideas in the speech, the border police, the partnership with Africa, these are great ideas. They would have been a lot better if they were happening 3 years ago. It's not like the migration crisis is a new thing. It's not like we didn't know that governments and the EU needed to be in control of Europe's borders.
Maricha, what stood out for you in that entire speech?
Well, I agree it was haphazard. It was really jumping between topics, but I was really sitting at the tip of my seat when Jean-Claude Juncker started talking about Syria. We are really witnessing a looming bloodbath in Idlib, and he said we cannot be bystanders. And I fundamentally agree. Europe cannot be a bystander when these terrible events are bound to happen, and we need to intervene, but then nothing came. And so I think it really underlines the fact that we are not strong enough of a global player, that we do not have our defense cooperation in order. And so I thought it was challenging to see where there was agendas and where there were assessments of actual weak points that we urgently need to fix.
So you both bring up the same point, where you said that could have been an idea 3 years ago. You said nothing has really changed. Europe is not doing much. So what kind of legacy is Jean-Claude Juncker leaving? Was this a legacy speech, and what does it say about him?
It was somewhat of a backward-looking speech, not only a forward-looking speech. I think, unfortunately for Juncker, some of his legacy is going to be around Brexit. It's not that he's personally to blame for it necessarily, but you can't escape that that's the big rupture happening during his time as European Commission President. One of the other things that people don't talk about a lot, but that has worked well from meeting your objective standpoint, is reducing the amount of legislation that comes out of the Commission. That's a clear change from the previous Commission. And then his investment investment plan, this idea where you leverage finance through the European Investment Bank rather than just give euro for euro grants out of the EU budget. That's a very clear success, and it's a model for what's going to happen in this Africa partnership. So in a way, he's saying, this worked in Europe, let's go and give that opportunity to Africa.
Yeah, what do you think about those new measures that he announced? So do you see the partnership with Africa, for example, or strengthening borders? Are you optimistic? What do you think about that?
Well, I think looking at Europe's position in the world is very, very urgent. There's a real, power play between China, that's very active in Africa, the US, that is changing direction under the leadership of President Trump. So it's urgent that we claim our position and a values-based position in the world. But indeed, the partnership with Africa, developments in Africa and the need for the EU to be involved can hardly be called new. They're very urgent still, but I hope that, 10 million jobs, it's a good target, but there's a lot more we can do towards sustainability, towards trade, towards security, and towards providing for a package of measures that give people better opportunities. And maybe that will help towards reducing migration.
Right. The speech might not have had the punch you were talking about, but then we had some reactions from MEPs in the chamber. So let's take a look.
Is the European Union in a better shape now than it was when you took office? And I think the answer is clear. No. There has never been a time in the history of European integration where Europe was more disunited than it is now.
My proposal is, Jean-Claude, be ambitious. You have said, and that will be my conclusion, that this was in fact the Commission of the last chance. You remember that, 4 years ago. And I'm always asking myself, what can come after the Commission of the last chance in the coming years? So I think what will come is something different. The Commission that we need in the future, dear colleagues, will be more than that. It will be a type of a new, renewed European government, what we need.
Well, Mr. Juncker, what a picture you paint. A European Union of peace, of prosperity, of contentedness. And as you said, you're trying to make it a little more perfect every day. Well, it's a very good advertising slogan, but tell you what surprised me. Since your last State of the Union speech, there's been a seismic political event in Europe, perhaps one even on a par with Brexit. Italy, a founding member of the Union, the third biggest economy in the Eurozone, now has a coalition government between the Five Stars and Lega that is polling over 60% of the vote and is posing a direct challenge, both in terms of the management of the Eurozone and indeed how the migration crisis is handled. You made no acknowledgement of that at all. No acknowledgement of the populist revolt. I noted your continued use of the phrase sovereign Europe. What you're talking about is a deeper centralisation of power.
So there we have it. Very interesting discussions in what MEPs are saying. Do you think that the criticism is fair? I'll put it to you, Marietje, as an MEP, that he's in denial, Jean-Claude Juncker, about what has actually been achieved?
Well, I do think that this is very much a policy speech that doesn't necessarily resonate with the average European. And I think that is the task ahead of us. We have an election year coming up, and I think it is crucial that also members of European Parliament that may want to be re-elected will go out there and show that Europe adds value, can come up with solutions that are close to people, and give Europe color for people, not in technicalities, not in budget lines, but really in solutions that matter for people and that can take some of the concerns away. Because I think if we look at Europe today, we see a lot of challenges, and part of the population thinks that Europe is part of the problem, and another part can see Europe as part of the solution. And so it is crucial that we can make that link to people everywhere in Europe that are not used to talking in policy terms or in speech words. And that, I do believe, is a challenge for all of us. And that didn't really come across. With the lack of energy, it wasn't really visionary, it wasn't really touching the heart. It was rather a list of talking points.
Yes, because some of the people that we had on the panel in the past couple of days were saying that what Europe needs now is vision.
Yeah.
And we did see that, did we?
No, and it doesn't have to be a big, huge general vision. He could have looked the camera straight down the barrel and said to the people of Italy who might be doubting the EU, here's 3 reasons why you shouldn't give up on the EU. And here's one thing that I'm going to do in the next 12 months, my final 12 months, to make sure you can still believe in Europe like I believe in Europe. And I just didn't feel that come across at all.
Right, and speaking of opinions, as you both were raising, our team in the Cube in Lyon have been looking into this. Let's cross over to them. What do you have for us?
Hello to you, Tessa. Well, obviously, everyone looking at the elder statesman of Europe, as some people see Jean-Claude Juncker. But what about the young voices of Europe? What about the next generation of Europeans? What do they have to say? Well, here in the Cube, we've been reaching out to a lot of young people from the European Youth Forum. Now, they're obviously, as you can imagine, quite engaged in wanting to debate about the future of Europe. And they were really keenly watching this speech. Let's just bring you up some of what they had to say here. This is Karina. She's 28 years old, and she's from Austria. Now, for her, Jean-Claude Juncker touched on youth unemployment, which was a key issue. But for her view, anyway, it didn't go far enough. Let's hear what she had to say.
The European Union is slowly recovering from the financial crisis. Youth unemployment might be lower than it was some years ago. But we also need to ensure that young people have quality jobs and also have access to social rights and that their social rights are protected.
So an idea here that, yes, Juncker might have touched upon it, but he didn't go far enough in actually dealing with it. I think we're hearing that from the panel discussion there. Well, there's Andre here in Belgium, and for him it was climate change, you know, talking about it. But what was the action? Let's see what he had to say.
In the State of the European Union, Juncker talked a lot about climate change. He talked a lot, but he didn't promise any action. And action is what we young people need. Because if we're not doing it now, the problems are only getting worse, and future generations need to deal with it.
Let me just finally end with you on Kristen here. Now, Kristen, she is 25. She's from Estonia. And for her, the future of Europe is about getting young people elected and more involved in that way. Let's hear what she had to say.
President Juncker called for next year to be a landmark for democracy. This can only happen if all citizens are equally part of this process and barriers to young people's participation are removed. Political parties need to give real electable positions to young candidates, and candidates and parties in their programs need to speak about issues that matter to young voters.
So that's just a flavour of what some young people are saying in Estonia, in Austria, in Belgium. But Tessa, as you're saying there's a lot of opinions going around. And I think a lot of people feel Jean-Claude Juncker delivered a speech that didn't really offer much in the way of substance that they wanted to hear.
All right, thank you for that, Alex and our Cube team. Well, joining me now, someone who knows a lot about communicating the Commission's message to Europeans, Margaritis Skinas, the chief spokesperson for the EU Commission, and also with us, Darren McCaffrey, our political editor here at Euronews. I will begin with you, Margaritis. I mean, the young people were saying that, well, you know what, Europe is not actually talking to us or doing something for us, anything for us. What do you think?
Well, I don't agree with that. I think that Europe is a diverse entity of 28 member states, of almost 500 million people. You cannot talk to everybody at the same time with the same message. What was important today, I think, in the president's speech is that he struck the right balance between a rather pragmatic assessment of the political and economic situation around us in Europe, but also a quite punchy, visionary view of what is to come in the next 14 months of this Commission. I think he struck the right balance. It was a very Junckerite speech, if I may. It was Juncker himself speaking. And I think the overwhelming reactions that we saw, both here in the European Parliament, in the national capitals and across Europe, are very encouraging.
We just heard our guest earlier who was saying actually it wasn't that punchy and there wasn't a lot of vision. And so how do you say that is actually communicating to Europeans?
I just happened to see that there was an overwhelming positive reception from heads of state and government across the European...
Well, heads of state, but not your voters, you know, your citizens, the young people.
I have seen in the European Parliament the presidents of all major pro-European groups saluting the approach of the president. Of course, Ryan and few journalists will never be happy with what we produce at the Commission, but I think the overall reception was good. And probably what
how dare you would never be happy. I think Margarita's point about the balance and it was a balanced speech, is part of the problem. So you've got people like Guy Verhofstadt saying it was not ambitious enough, he wants more ambition. For people like Nigel Farage and Eurosceptics, it goes too far. And that is the fundamental problem in many ways where the European Union finds itself. Europe's facing many big issues at the moment. Big issues like migration, big issues such as the rise of populism and the far right. And for voters are falling into two camps. Those that think that Europe is the answer, and a growing number of people who think that Europe is part of the problem. And the problem is that in that speech, there was no real addressal to the people who feel that Europe is increasingly part of the problem. There was a kind of sense of denial that is happening.
I beg to disagree with that, if you allow me, because what President Juncker put forward today was not an abstract, empty vision. It was full of meat. There was lots of specific policy proposals. There was lots about the Europe that protects, about external borders, about putting together our resources where our problems are, about buying an insurance contract against those who want to interfere in the European elections of next year. Concrete proposals on cybersecurity, subsidiarity, a new deal for Africa. These are major policy proposals.
But not in a way that would...
Yeah, I think in the sense that, in the grand scheme of things, that, this speech was not going to change your impression of the European Union.
But Darren, you must have had your impression, because...
We did. And I managed to grab a short while with Jean-Claude Juncker at lunchtime. And this is what he had to say in a very brief interview. Let's have a look.
4 years ago, you stood up and said you wanted to be frank, that Europe was not in a good state. Surely 4 years later, under your stewardship, it's got worse.
No, that's the way some of our British colleagues in Parliament are presenting things. I don't think that things have developed in a bad direction. We have growth, 21 trimester following one the other. The unemployment has gone down, the budgetary deficits went down, investment is at a level where it was during the crisis. So I don't share the view of those who are saying that everything is dark. There is sunshine somewhere.
There are problems though, migration, Brexit, populism.
Yes, but...
Aren't you in denial a little bit?
No, not at all. I'm not naive. I know exactly where the problems do exist. Populism is a problem. Brexit is a disaster, and the fact that member states were unable to agree on the basic answers to be given to the migration problem is making me sad. That's not the Commission, because the Commission made its proposals in March 2015. If member states, all of the member states, would have been as wise as the Commission was 4 years ago, things would have developed in a different way.
On Brexit, there's talk from Michel Barnier, from others in Britain, that a deal can be done in 6 to 8 weeks. Do you think a deal will be done?
I share the views of Michel Barnier.
And one final question, in one word, what's your biggest regret of your presidency?
The fact that the European institutions were unable to bridge the differences between East and West.
All right, Darren, what was your main takeaway from that?
I think it's interesting. We heard this in the speech as well. A slight potential passing of the buck, or a recognition at least of reality, that the Commission can't be blamed for everything, and that Jean-Claude Juncker can't be blamed for all the problems in the European Union. Okay, we'll make that fair point. But isn't that also part of the problem? That this is a union made of lots of countries, but also lots of institutions, and that whoever is president, their hands are constantly tied.
Well, but this is what the European Union is all about. This is not Washington, this is Brussels. We have a division of power where decision-making authorities shared between institutions and the capitals. I'm aware that there are many expectations bestowed upon the Commission emerging as a system that can decide to do and undo things, but reality, institutional reality, is much more complex than that. We have proposals to defend, we have MEPs to convince, we have capitals to win over. So I understand this, at times it's a mixture of self-flagellation and increased expectations, but that's life around us.
It is, and that's democracy to a degree, but it's also the Achilles heel of the European Union. You know, Ryan was talking earlier on about migration. You know, this is something potentially that should have been in place 3 years ago, not now. And that I think is what Europeans are crying out for. They want solution to these big problems, and the European Union might be able to provide them, but it will be years down the line simply because no one institution can ever take the lead at any one time.
If you allow me a comment on this 3 years ago thing. 3 years ago, we laid the groundwork for an EU migration policy that worked. We have saved 700,000 people in the Mediterranean. We have reduced the flows by 94% in the Aegean and 80% in the central Mediterranean. We have a system of hotspots that can distinguish asylum seekers from those that need to be returned. All this is there.
But you've also seen a massive increase in public opinion against migration, and people who think it's being mishandled.
Yes, because the people who think it's being mishandled are misinformed by certain national governments that they want to Europeanize failure and nationalize success. Okay. And this is costing us.
Margaritis, you worked really closely with Jean-Claude Juncker. In one word, how would you describe his legacy? One word.
One word. Mr. Europe working for the common interest of all.
That's a lot of words. All right.
It's quite difficult.
Indeed.
We'll give him that.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that.